point to ponder. Flail chest. A 2020s approach to modern treatment. A flail chest is when three or more adjacent ribs are fractured in two or more places. This creates a flail segment that seems to move paradoxically, or in the opposite direction, as the patient's chest wall moves in and out as they breathe. Treatment once called for placing a patient supine and immobilizing them to a long backboard. We used to restrict the chest wall movement with a large, bulky dressing, encompassing the whole flail segment of the chest wall. Well, modern medicine teaches us now that we should be placing the patient in a position of comfort, most often in a high Fowler's position. We maintain an open airway and provide respiratory support as needed, and this includes supplemental oxygen if they need it. Don't forget to monitor for respiratory complications, like a pneumothorax or a pulmonary contusion. As with any complicated airway, positive pressure ventilation with a bag valve mask may be necessary. And that's your point to ponder. Here's your point to ponder. Some care and feeding tips on ropes, webbing, and other software. Washing and cleaning. Soak the rope or webbing in a tub of warm to hot water. Use a non-detergent or biodegradable soap to loosen dirt or other materials. Dawn, All, Persil, and Woolite are some great suggestions. Watch the whiteners though. Avoid anything with bleach or color-safe whiteners. The rope might look great, but the fibers may become damaged. Rinse 2 or 3 times through a rope washer if you have one. But what if you don't have one? Use the washing machine. Machine washing is okay when using a non-detergent soap as discussed. A machine with a center agitator is definitely not recommended. Water temperature is not a concern for us. Our machines just don't get hot enough to cause any damage. Now it's time to dry. Flake out the rope or webbing over a table, a hose rack, or something similar. The bags should be laid flat. Cool shade is the best. Out of the sun, remember, is a must. Keep an eye out for bare metal. No one likes a rusty rope or webbing. Now let's pack it all up. Now that it's dry, repack your ropes, webbing, and other software into their issued bags. Return the bags to the correct compartments, which should be clean, dry, and free of chemicals. Make an apparatus defect report to CMF if your compartment causes you concern. Inspections. It is vital to inspect rope and webbing thoroughly before and after use. This should be done both visually and by sliding the rope or webbing through your hands, foot by foot. You're looking for excessive abrasions, heat damage, exposed core, or a twisted, lumpy core. These are signs of major damage and are considered out-of-service conditions. Finally, don't forget to log each use and cleaning. And that's been your point to ponder. And here's a point to ponder. Flail chest. A 2020s approach to modern treatment. A flail chest is when 3 or more adjacent ribs are fractured in 2 or more places. This creates a flail segment that seems to move paradoxically, or in the opposite direction, as the patient's chest wall moves in and out as they breathe. Treatment once called for placing a patient supine and immobilizing them to a long backboard. We used to restrict the chest wall movement with a large, bulky dressing, encompassing the whole flail segment of the chest wall. Well, modern medicine teaches us now that we should be placing the patient in a position of comfort, most often in a high Fowler's position. We maintain an open airway and provide respiratory support as needed, and this includes supplemental oxygen if they need it. Don't forget to monitor for respiratory complications, like a pneumothorax or a pulmonary contusion. As with any complicated airway, positive pressure ventilation with a bag valve mask may be necessary. And that's your point to ponder. Here's your point to ponder. Some care and feeding tips on ropes, webbing, and other software. Washing and cleaning. Soak the rope or webbing in a tub of warm to hot water. Use a non-detergent or biodegradable soap to loosen dirt or other materials. Dawn, All, Persil, and Woolite are some great suggestions. Watch the whiteners though. Avoid anything with bleach or color-safe whiteners. The rope might look great, but the fibers may become damaged. Rinse 2 or 3 times through a rope washer if you have one. But what if you don't have one? Use the washing machine. Machine washing is okay when using a non-detergent soap as discussed. A machine with a center agitator is definitely not recommended. Water temperature is not a concern for us. Our machines just don't get hot enough to cause any damage. Now it's time to dry. Flake out the rope or webbing over a table, a hose rack, or something similar. The bags should be laid flat. Cool shade is the best. Out of the sun, remember, is a must. Keep an eye out for bare metal. No one likes a rusty rope or webbing. Now let's pack it all up. Now that it's dry, repack your ropes, webbing, and other software into their issued bags. Return the bags to the correct compartments, which should be clean, dry, and free of chemicals. Make an apparatus defect report to CMF if your compartment causes you concern. Inspections. It is vital to inspect rope and webbing thoroughly before and after use. This should be done both visually and by sliding the rope or webbing through your hands, foot by foot. You're looking for excessive abrasions, heat damage, exposed core, or a twisted, lumpy core. These are signs of major damage and are considered out-of-service conditions. Finally, don't forget to log each use and cleaning. And that's been your point to ponder.
for the slight delay in getting started. Had to work through a technical difficulty. Proud to present another presentation, COPDI presentation. The topic's going to be Water Supply Task Force Operations. And that'll be presented by Chief Mark Davis. Couple things to cover. This presentation is going to focus at the CCO level. Unlike the Challenge in the Streets episodes that we've been putting out there, this one's going to focus at the CCO level, but all personnel are welcome to participate in the presentation. We're in the classroom in the PSTA. We do not have an audience here, so we encourage questions. But if you have questions, you need to come up on the chat, in the chat box, and I'll present them to Chief Davis. We do have a few future presentations, COPDI presentations. One will be taught, the next one will be taught by Acting Battalion Chief Sam Villani, and that'll be on fire dynamics. That'll be a full 3-hour presentation. And then we have a COPDI prep. That'll be on the next the next Command Competencies evaluation. And that'll cover the scenario at hand, which we'll talk about later on at another time. So again, if you have questions, come up on the chat box. I'll get them in as soon as we get a break to break in, to cut in on the conversation. And at the end, I will put out a link. That'll be a feedback link. So if you have any feedback related to this presentation, please fill out that link for us. All right, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Chief Davis, and he'll get started. Thank you.
Thanks, Chief Thomas. So good afternoon. Welcome to everybody who's joining in live on this, right? You know, this is one of our big forays into trying to figure out how do we change the delivery of training, specifically after the whole pandemic stuff. So your feedback is important on all of this. You realize by now we're trying a couple different platforms. This has been the one we've been running for a while, the YouTube Live. There is some talk about trying out some Zoom stuff and some other things, so your feedback is important. What I would ask is that those of you who are watching it live, if you take a moment to type in where you're watching it from and what platform and what device, right? So I'm watching it from Station 2 on my iPad, and meaning, you know, so we would figure out the iPad would be Safari and that kind of stuff. Anyway, you get the idea. That data is important to us. So there are no students in class, so it is going to be up to everybody out there to ask some questions as we go along. Clearly, I have a program outlined. We will not run more than 1 hour. There will not be a break during this period. So it's important that you follow along. See if I had anything else. I want to close this door real quick, so I'm going to step out of the camera. I'll be right back. Another thing we're interested in hearing back from folks, especially chief officers, is the format, right? So we have some choices, the 1 hour format, the 3 hour format, the hour-and-a-half format. Is there a preference? Do you care? Do you rather have a 3 hour block of time? Just some general feedback would be important because there's just different ways of doing this. Some topics are shorter and others aren't. So any feedback you got, please provide that back to Chief Thomas. So the way it's going to run, I'll present some stuff. If you have a question, you type it in. Chief Thomas will notify me that, hey, there's a comment or a question, and then we'll take a moment to answer that. Do have to realize there's a bit of a delay sometimes, so just be patient. I'll try to be patient as well. All right, let's get started. So we decided that we wanted to talk about water supply task force operations. We don't run the water supply task force too often, right? We know about that we have the capability of having it dispatched, and in most all cases, it's going to come to a rural water supply assignment or a non-hydrated box area assignment. Doesn't mean I can't ask for it in downtown Silver Spring. I can. We just don't normally think about that. So we're going to focus on the use of the water supply task force in our non-hydrogen areas, some considerations regarding the task force. What do I get? Where does it come from? How do I call for it? And then what do I do when I get it? Probably one of the important things to keep in mind is that the incident commander is probably not going to deal with the water supply task force, right? The incident commander is going to deal with calling for it, most likely, making sure it's on the way, but then that gets pushed off to somebody else to manage it. Most likely that's going to occur. When it occurs in the incident, well, that can vary some, but that's primarily how that's going to work. So we always like, or I always like to start with, what do you remember? So I'm going to offer you up a 10 minutes, 8-10 minutes to take a quiz. You can take this at home. You don't have to reply back to the YouTube, but I do want you to be able to answer all of these questions. So the first one's up. Right, list the quantity and type of units dispatched on a water supply task force. In other words, how many of what do I get? Number 2 is list 2 ways of getting a water supply task force dispatched. Number 3, list all of Montgomery County stations that operate a tanker, and that's going to be the radio designation tanker. Number 4 is list all the Montgomery County stations that operate an engine tanker. And then we're going to go outside the county because a lot of our non-hydrogen box area relies on our mutual aid partners. So number 5 asks you to list the 3 Howard County tankers or engine tankers, I'll give you credit for either one, that are closest to Montgomery County. In other words, they would show up potentially on either our initial dispatch or a water supply task force. So I'll give you 4 minutes to work on this, and then I'm going to switch to the next 5. Go. You got about 20 more seconds on this one, then I'm going to switch over to the next 5 questions. We'll come back to take a look one more time, but just briefly. All right, here we go. Go into the next 5. So continuing on our mutual aid stuff. Oh, there's my timer. List the Carroll County tanker that is closest to Montgomery County. We need one of those. Which one's closest? Number 7 is list 2 Frederick County engine tankers or tankers that are closest to Montgomery County. So you think about those 3 questions, they address the mutual aid companies that commonly run into Montgomery, as we noted. Number 8, describe the duties of the engine company that's assigned to the Water Supply Task Force. Number 9, explain the role of the Water Supply Group Supervisor. And number 10, list the key limitation of a nurse tanker operation. And that is going to be one of the most important things for us here in Montgomery. What is the limitation when we choose to use nurse tanker operation only, meaning pumping the water off as compared to a dump tank? So I'll give you 4 minutes to do that. Ready, set, go. We'll then to look at the first, and then we're going to move on with the presentation. Gotcha. I have about 20 seconds left on this. I'll flip back one more time to the other screen, and then we're just going to move on, and we will answer these as we go through. But at least wanted you to think about this stuff in the beginning as we get started. All right, time's up. Let's run back those. Sorry, those were the first 5, right? Bottom line is, throughout the course of the presentation, we're going to talk about just about all of this, right? So why don't you start thinking about it? The Water Supply Task Force, right? It's a bundle of resources that we can call for as incident commanders or company officers or whatever. So our objective here for this session of COPDI is we want to talk about the Water Supply Task Force and some operational considerations that we would use in the use of those assets on the scene of emergency. Right? We just don't use them that often. So you think about the number of rural or non-hydrant box alarms that are run in Montgomery County, not many. Even fewer water supply task forces that get dispatched, and then even fewer actual use of the Water Supply Task Force. So we just don't have a lot of repetition of using this stuff. And there has to be some flexibility in terms of how it's used, because by the time we've had the request, and if the incident commander is really going to use this stuff, well, there kind of has to start to be a plan, and you have a fire, right? You have a fire that the box alarm could not have controlled with the water that they brought. All right, so as an overview, we already did, hey, what do you remember? We're going to talk about the components of the Water Supply Task Force, a little bit about dispatch, and if we have anybody from ECC that wants to hop in on that stuff, have at it. Some terminology stuff. Terminology is important. And talk about the water supply officer. What role does that person play? How does that get appointed? And then really we'll finish up with considerations. And really the consideration part, that's going to be where I want to talk about more of a discussion as opposed to, hey, this is what we do. All right, so you had your test your memory. Hopefully that wasn't too painful and everybody made it through okay and you didn't run somewhere and look that stuff up. All right, so let's talk about the Water Supply Task Force. What is it? So what comprises that? So we have engines, tankers. Do we have water supply units on it? Do we have command officers unit on it? Do we have brush trucks on it? Do we use the term task force leader? Does mutual aid come under a water supply task force? And what about a fireboat, right? So in different jurisdictions throughout the area and throughout the country, folks call for bundles of resources in different ways. A task force is a common way. In Montgomery County, we've run the Water Supply Task Force for a while, right? A number of years. It's an option that's out there that allows us to call for additional water supply units. Where's it identified at? It's not identified clearly in a lot of places. It has been in our dispatch process. We do have 2 parts of the IRP that do talk about water supply operations. One being Appendix F, right, Incident Response Policy, Water Supply Operations, and that talks about the urban and the non-urban. And it talks about water supply officer, and it talks about a variety of different things, relay pumping, dump site operations. And then we have Appendix Q, which is definitions. So as we go through here, I want to point out some of those definitions. So I would encourage you to go back and review the Water Supply Operations Appendix, and then at least be familiar with some common terminology, because I played some tricks in here on some of that quiz, right? And some of the things we talk about. All right, so what is it? So you get 3 engines. Excuse me, yeah, 3 tankers. And an engine. And that's it. You do get the full page, which means notification of, hey, a water supply task force has been dispatched. but you don't get a chief officer. If another one goes, that's fine, but there is no alerting of a chief officer to respond on the Water Supply Task Force. Same way with the task force, same way with the RID. Those who've been around for a while may have remembered the safety dispatch. Back in the early days of the safety dispatch, there was a chief officer that would assume that role. All of that no longer exists, right? So you only get the chief officer's due on the original box alarm or house fire assignment. So you get 3 tankers, an engine, and that's it. You don't get water supply units, right? So we're not alerting a water supply unit to go. Nobody's designated as a water supply unit. We don't run any specialized water supply units. You go to Howard County, they do, right? So you will hear a couple, Howard Engine 4.2 is a water supply piece. They run a water supply piece out of 3, I believe, right? But you hear that on the radio, but they are not going to be part of coming to Montgomery. They may choose to send it either by accident or by miscommunication at the communication center, but the bottom line is we do not run a water supply unit, right? Command officers already spoke about that. Brush trucks, we don't send brush trucks on water supply task forces. Some jurisdictions use a brush truck occasionally as a water supply piece, depending upon its rated pump capacity. Task force leader, that is not a term that we use here in this particular setting. Nobody on this water supply task force carries the title task force leader. Mutual aid, absolutely. So you think about in Montgomery County, let's talk about who runs tankers in Montgomery County. So we'll just make a pass across the top of the county. Right? If you think of the county as somewhat of a big wedge, we'll start with 14, right? So 14 runs a tanker, drop down a little bit below them, 31, 22 runs a tanker, 9 runs a tanker, 13 runs a tanker. Dropping down from 13, we have 17. Running over towards Howard County, right, we have 4. See that I miss any? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 30 even further down. And I'll ask for a minute, what's kind of unusual about 30? What does 30 do that nobody else does? Give it a moment here to answer. I know they do water rescue, I talk about that. What does 30 do that most of those others don't ever do? Go to Fairfax County, right? So you will often hear them dispatched to go to Fairfax, especially now with the integrated CADs. So it gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 tankers. We do have an engine tanker, so 17 runs the engine tanker. All right, so so you think about on that initial assignment, you're getting 3 tankers on the box alarm, and then a water supply task force gets you 3 more. So somewhere in the mix of all this, we are taking 6 of these on a working fire where we have the water supply task force going. You have a question, Chief Thomas?
Chief Hines says, he makes a comment, 30 is the only non-elliptical tank on their tanker.
Yes, so that's true. It is. It is a square-sided tanker. 3,000, I believe. I might be wrong. Don't remember off the top of my head. So when we have a incident in the core of Montgomery County, well, we're pretty much okay in terms of Montgomery resources. When we start to hit the periphery, well, then that's quite different. That's where we're going to draw in our mutual aid partners. So it is very probable on a working incident on the boundary of Montgomery County that you're going to have mutual aid tankers that roll in. So if we take a look at those, right, so there's kind of, I'll say Howard County over here, right? You got Howard County, you have a little bit of Carroll County, and then you have a big swath of Frederick. And there is Fairfax, and Fairfax can send the tanker. I don't think we've had an incident yet where we've had a Fairfax tanker on a water supply task force. Not saying it couldn't happen in 30's area, because we certainly have had ladder trucks from Fairfax. But if we look at the periphery here, right, you got 14 out of Frederick County, you got 23 out of Frederick County, you got 25 out of Frederick County. They all run some version of an engine tanker or tanker. And on our water supply task force, we don't differentiate between that, right? So if we ask Frederick County for a tanker, they can send us an engine tanker. Out of Carroll, we have tanker 1 out of Mount Airy. Out of Howard County, we see the engine tanker out of Lisbon, out of 4. Probably the biggest help to us has been 13's tanker when they opened the Glenwood station. And then we see tanker 5 and then tanker 11. So if you're on the east part of the county, that Burtonsville, Olney area, you can easily get 4, 5, and 11 on the initial dispatch. Anyway, those folks who work in that area, serve in that area, right? If you're a command officer in that area, you should know who's coming on your call. Chief Thomas for a question.
Rob King had a question. How about Loudoun County tankers in 14's area?
I don't think we have seen them on the Water Supply Task Force, but if anybody is working at ECC right now and watching, if you have the ability to pull up a box card for, let's just say, Route 28 at the county line, whatever that would be, see what that Water Supply Task Force gets us. Unless somebody has experience of seeing them, I don't recall. Another question.
Matt Thews points out that Frederick no longer has tankers at 14 or 25. The closest are going to be 23, 33, 17, and 1.
They don't have an engine tanker at 25?
Ian St. John is saying stand by. He said nope.
So they had that big engine tanker at 25. All right, so we'll sort that out. It's not super critical to what we're talking about, other than realize on the periphery, you're going to expect to see mutual aid partners, right? So what does that mean? Different capacities, different way of doing business a little bit. Familiar with us, but just a little bit different, right? Yes, another question.
Yeah, Ian is saying that 923 now has a tanker, engine tanker. 925 is no more.
Gotcha. So 23 out of Frederick-Urbana does, 25 does not. So, and actually that's going to be okay, because when 25 out of Frederick did, 13 had nothing. So now our 13 has a tanker, and that's going to make up for that difference. And right, a designated driver on that. Fireboats, no, right? We don't have anybody that runs a fireboat in our area that we would be using, but I throw that up there because sometimes you see pictures of fireboats doing stuff, but none of that. So what do we have? We run engines and tankers. You don't get a command officer. You do get the full assignment alert. We don't have water supply units. I do caution you, it is possible to hear that coming out of Howard County, and that could be a miscommunication, or they just chose to send it, or whatever. I don't know that you turn that around, but just realize it wasn't part of what we asked for, right? And those do exist up there, and they do run them as part of their response. All right, dispatch process. What, when, who, and how. So what, we just talked about that. It's a water supply task force. I think one of the questions asked about how do you call for it. So, right, there's really 2 ways. One would be, obviously, you get on the radio and start the water supply task force. 2 would be, and it's kind of like that RID, right, when there is pretty good intel that there is a fire, but nobody's on the scene yet, or the first arriving engine gets on the scene and indicates they have a working fire, some indication of a working fire. They don't necessarily have to say water supply task force. Working fire in a non-hydrogen area is supposed to get you the RID and a water supply task force. Understand you can always call for it, right? That doesn't matter, but it is kind of built into the system. So the map you see is the hydrant area of Montgomery County, and that's 1,000 feet from all hydrants. So if we go back to my drawing on the board, right? Back to that periphery, right? We go back, there's that swath across the top where we expect to see our non-hydrogenated box alarms come in, and thus where we would expect to see the use of the Water Supply Task Force. Chief Thomas, you had your hand up. Was there a question?
Yes, and you may address this later on, I'm not sure. But when would you consider changing the order between the Water Supply Task Force and the Rapid Intervention Dispatch? I've heard that done before.
So that is tricky. I don't know what the right answer is. The bigger deal is we've expanded our tanker fleet, right? So way back when we started this, there were not tons of tankers. And if you look at every one of those tankers, if everybody's home in quarters, what does that tanker have? A driver. Not waiting on somebody to come from home to get on it, not somebody whatever, right? If everybody's in quarters, that rig has a driver. So when you're running a box alarm with 14, 9, and 22, not only are you getting their engines, you're getting their darn tankers out the door right away, right? We all understand that somebody could be on another call, somebody could be at Fromm's. I understand that. We're not building on that. We're building on everybody at home. So where that used to come into play was, well, what happens if I call for the RID and 31 is the RID engine, right, which we don't send anymore. The RID engine brought the tanker driver for 31, and then you hit the task force. So that used to be a big deal. It has backed off some now where that calling for the RID before the tanker, or excuse me, the Water Supply Task Force may not be as crippling. It was at one point simply because of the amount of tankers we have. So I don't know that I have a clean answer for that. We had argued it sometimes. I want the Water Supply Task Force dispatched first, but we have fixed a lot of that with 4-person staffing and dedicated a driver in the firehouse for that tanker and adding to the tanker fleet. So what, when do you do? We talked about that. Who calls for it? It can be a variety of people, right? You don't have to be on the scene to call for it if you truly believe you have a fire. And the how, we mentioned that, built into the dispatch process. All right, some terminology: attack tanker, nurse tanker, tanker shuttle, dump site operations, fill site, water supply officer. I'll ask the audience, what is special about the terms that are underlined? Give you a couple moments to answer. What is special about the terms that are underlined on the slide you see on the PowerPoint? Anybody hop in with an answer or not? No. It's kind of a trick question, but it's reasonably important to know, I think. Those are terms identified in Appendix Q of the Incident Response Policy, which is the definitions, right? So attack tanker, defined in the policy. Nurse tanker, nowhere to be found. Tanker shuttle, defined in the policy, right? Dump site operations, defined in the policy. Fill site, not in the definitions of the policy. Water supply officer, in the policy. I'll come back to the water supply officer here in a little bit. All right, let's just run through. So attack tanker, that was the terminology that the group chose to use, right? That is where we would expect the first arriving tanker to co-locate with the first 2 engines somewhere in proximity to the fire. Their job, and let me erase this. That's a little problematic. It's like COVID got the eraser. Marker. Oh, there we go. All right, so bottom line is wherever the fire is located, whether it's 100 feet off the road, 1,100 feet off the road, it doesn't matter, right? The goal is somewhere in proximity to that, we have the 2 engines and the first tanker. And their job, co-locate, figure it out, apply water in the fire, do all that stuff was identified, right? You could go back to the videos that Chief Bush and I made a couple years ago, helps explain all that. You then have a whole bunch of other stuff coming, right? You have engine 3 that's coming, engine 4 that's coming, engine 5 that's coming, engine 6 that may or may not come past the fire, tanker 2, tanker 3, they are all coming, they are all bringing water. So you have to figure out what you do with them when they get there. The Water Supply Task Force comes after all of that, right? So if you have the big fire and you have called for the Water Supply Task Force, you basically are saying that you do not believe you can control the fire with the water that was brought on the initial assignment. And that's a lot of water. So the folks coming on that Water Supply Task Force have got to be ready to support that fire attack. Otherwise, they wouldn't have called for you. And I always tell folks, if I'm the first tanker on that Water Supply Task Force, and I'm offloading my water, there is really a fire, right? Otherwise, we're not going to do that, right? It's the fire department. We're not doing, hold on, Johnny, don't dump that yet. We may not need it, right? So if I am giving up that water on that first tanker, there clearly is a fire and I need to be replenishing water. That means all of these would have been exhausted and all that kind of stuff, right? So the plan has to be laid coming in, thinking about, we're going to that, it's a fire, I got to support that operation, and I'll bring it up here in a moment on considerations, right? But this is our attack tanker operation. That's what we chose to use. We did not use nurse tanker. You may still hear that on the radio. Certainly mutual aid partners coming. They're going to talk about nurse tanker operation. Nurse tanker means you're pumping it off. Tanker shuttle, right? That's simply where the tanker goes to get another load of water. We have means in place for that, fill site operations, right? That's what that 6th engine is supposed to do. Most likely it's not going to show up at the fire. It's going to go to a fill site and start getting that set up. Dump site operations, right? That is going to be when we transition, should we choose to transition to a dump tank operation. Chances are pretty darn good, if you've called for a Water Supply Task Force, you're moving to dump tank operations. Otherwise, you would have resolved the incident or would have had a low enough flow to make that work fine. And then we have Water Supply Officer, and I will talk about that here in a moment. Notice it's not Water Supply Group Supervisor, it's the Water Supply Officer. Water Supply Officer, right? So in the big NIMS component, right, the water supply would be a group, and the terminology for that would be the Water Supply Group Supervisor. We just kept it simple. The folks stayed with Water Supply Officer. That's what most people talk about it as. That becomes important. That may or may not have been assigned prior to the Water Supply Task Force. There's no rule that says you got to, right? So for all of our command officers, if you do not assign a Water Supply Officer, who is the Water Supply Officer? I'll give the incident commander folks out there a moment to answer. So for all my chief officers, if you don't assign a Water Supply Officer, who is the Water Supply Officer? Ready, go. Any answers? And the answer is?
All right, Chief Bush says if you don't assign it, it is you.
That's right. Just like safety officer, you don't assign a safety officer, that's your call, you're the safety officer. You don't assign a PIO, you're it. Remember, you have to make those assignments. So The water supply officer is assigned by the incident commander. That can happen at any given time. I would tell you that if I'm the incident commander and I really have a fire and I'm running non-hydrant operations, I would like to get rid of that pretty quick, especially if it's going to be complex. Why? Get it out of my realm. These rigs hauling water matters not to, I don't really care how they do it other than they do it efficiently and effectively. I'm not worried about, I don't want that interfering with getting a second line to the second floor of the house, right? When, that's your choice. I'm going to say earlier the better, and when you have staffing ready for that. Who, that again is your choice. A lot of folks pick out, right? They know folks who are good at that particular craft, right? People who are good in that area of the county who would know where things are, know the resources coming, they can pick that. Where? Probably not at the command post. The water supply officer probably needs to be a little bit mobile. Most likely, the better place is wherever all of this is functioning at, right? So where that double clappered Siamese is, where that dump tank is, whatever, probably the better place for them, at least early on, as opposed to sitting in the command vehicle with you. Not saying I'm opposed to that, but they're probably better off down there, at least for initially. And what do? They coordinate all of that, get everything off of that talk group, get those units all on another channel. That can be issues with mutual aid because mutual aid comes in late. They're going to mark up on, right? They're going to mark up on R7 Charlie or whatever, and you got to get them over to another channel. All those things complicate that. Once you got them there, it's generally okay, but just getting them moved over can be problematic. So water supply officer, not the water supply group supervisor. Our terminology, water supply officer, per the policy. All right, so then this brings us to just some considerations. I'm going to walk you through some stuff. None of it is written in stone because the policy does not say what the water supply task force does. It just says, hey, you can have one, and this is how they get called and that kind of stuff. So on the slide there, you see a couple things, and then I'm going to move to a tabletop display, lack of anything better. So water supply task force, right? Those units coming, you need to plan on supporting the existing water supply operation. That's number one. There may be plans for building it out. That's great, and you're probably going to be part of it. That's great, but what can't happen is you can't let what's existing fall apart while you try to build out something greater. Somebody has to grab control of that. Hopefully the water supply officer has, but if not, then those units that are on the scene trying to manage that are going to have to work through that, right? You've got to figure out, are we continuing to pump the water off, or are we going to go to a dump tank operation? The other consideration is, hey, are we plan on increasing fire flow, right? Are we waiting for these other tankers to get here so we can increase the flow? Increase the flow is generally going to mean that I'm probably going to have to move to my dump tank operations. I don't know. Well, let me go back there for a minute. What was the number one critical point of a nurse tanker operation in Montgomery County? What's the weakest link there? I'll give you a minute to answer. You would have already answered this in question 10. Any answers? I know there's a delay, but if I am pumping off water, trying to supply water to this big fire, what is the number one limitation of this entire operation? The answer is Chief.
Is lower.
Yep. And what rate?
Tim Kemp says fire flow GPMs limited to 500.
That's right.
Gibson says turnaround time. Jay Blake says size of the nurse tanker. Matthew says 1,000 GPMs on tankers.
So our number one pinch point is if we choose to pump off that water is going to be potentially limited to a 500-gallon minute offload by pumping. Now, we have some tankers that pump off faster. That's great. The problem is it's not consistent. So until we have every one of our tankers with the capability of pumping off at a higher rate, 500 is the minimum, or is the maximum of which we can feel comfortable supporting a Clapper Siamese operation. So all of our tankers are different. The older ones are slow, the new ones are fast, but I can't guarantee what we have, and then what I can't guarantee is mutual aid. So that's why the 500. So if your fire flow is more than 500, you've got to be ready to transition to dump tank operations. Most likely, the better consideration is let the Water Supply Task Force begin to build out that dump site operation. Yes, question.
Couple points here. Tim says pumping through tank to pump is limited to the size of the piping. Michelle Ruth asks, can you repeat what people are saying in the classroom, please? Well, there's nobody in the classroom.
Yep, we'll try. So whatever Chief Thomas is saying is what's coming in on the chat board, and there's no humans other than he and I in the classroom.
And Gibson asking for a city boy. By pumping off, do we mean dumping?
No, talking about pumping through hose. Which, let's take us to the tabletop. It's nothing fancy here, but at least I want to talk about, so what happens, right? So this is what I'm getting, right? I'm getting 3 tankers and an engine. Maybe another command officer, maybe not. Leave them out of the picture there, right? So they are going to have arrived on the scene, and there's a problem, meaning that there is a fire, and the only, think about it yourself, the only reason Tanker 1 on the Water Supply Task Force is going to pump water to the fire is because all the others are out. Right? We've exhausted all the water that we brought on that initial assignment. So the first arriving tanker on the Water Supply Task Force has got to be ready to do a variety of different things. Do I need them to pump off? Do I need them to support the double Clapper Siamese? Do I need them to dump water because we've already put some dump tanks down? I don't know. Every scenario is going to be different. Water supply officer needs to take that and grab that and give that direction, right? So, you know, whatever command to Montgomery we want to move all tankers to, right, 7 Delta, all tankers on 7 Delta or 7 Echo, whatever. They all get moved over there, water supply to Carroll County Tanker 1. As soon as you get here, pump to the double Clapper Siamese. We'll be ready for you. Or I need you to pull ahead of the engine and get off your dump tanks. You've got to give them direction because they're just coming. They haven't been part of this incident at all until they got alerted. They got no idea what's going on. Remember, the engine on the Water Supply Task Force, their job is not outlined either, but they should be thinking of secondary fill site. Go find another fill site, whatever that might be. And they probably may need some help with that because they're not going to be local either. Somebody's got to give them direction. Either to where the first fill site is to help out because, hey, it's a great big pond. You're at the lake at Clarksburg, whatever. Or send them somewhere else where they can establish a fill site. So basically, you got these 3 tankers. So let's just talk about some choices. Let's just say that you don't have dump tanks out, but you do have an engine there, right? And so the first arriving tanker is like, hey, I need you to support that double Clapper Siamese. Meanwhile, hey, grab his dump tanks and let's get them set up. Now, you would have seen, I think, in some of the video and some of the other video talking about, some of the training videos about our new tankers carry 2 dump tanks. I would get both of them off. If it's 13 or 31 showing up, grab both of them off. If you're moving the dump tank operations, get them both off of that rig. So then maybe this engine now is working to set up, right? However, we'll give them here. I'm not specific about where we're going. We'll give them there. Now the tanker is pumping off, and now you're ready for that next tanker in. You're going to be the first one to dump your water. You're still waiting back here, right? Meanwhile, you're going to transition over. That transition is messy. That's probably where we're going to fall down. We just don't do it a lot, and that's just the nature, right? We just don't run that many calls, and it's hard to work through all that and be proficient with it We are very proficient with pumping it off. So you think about our success really has been about pumping off the water early on. I'm going to tell you, on the Water Supply Task Force, as those assets are coming, you have to begin to think about dump tank operations, give me a second fill site. And that pretty much is how that's going to work. This transition becomes important. Let's say the first arriving tanker shows up and, hey, there's already a dump tank there. Well, that's easy, right? That's easy. Now you can just transition and go. Chances are that's not going to be the case. Chances are pretty good that, chances are pretty good that when that first mutual aid or a first tanker on the tanker task force gets there, we are ready to transition, and they're going to have to make that transition themselves with whatever people are there. Dump tanks off, help them get set up, try to go to the single lane stuff. That works pretty well for us, right? Advance to multiple tanks if we can, and then transfer, move over to dump tank operations. So that's kind of that, right? There's no easy policy. This is who does what, when, or where. A lot of it's going to be driven just by different stuff out there that's occurring, what apparatus is where, who brought what to where. If we don't have that double clapper, we're messed up, right? Double clapper's got to be there, and that should have been there throughout the whole box alarm to begin with, right? So Water Supply Task Force coming in, planning on, am I supporting nurse tanker only, attack tanker only, or are we going to go to dump tanks? I'm saying you got to be ready to transition to dump tanks. Water supply officers got to communicate that. All right, so we have a question, and then I just want to show a couple video clips, and then we're going to be done. So go with the question.
Jay Blake is asking, should they dump all the water, or is it more important to get the shuttle moving quicker?
So every one of our tankers has a critical dump time. We haven't done the newest ones, but they would probably be pretty similar. So every one of those tankers from back whenever we tested them, they have a critical dump time to where they no longer wait and they just go. If they are dumping their water on these 3,500 ellipticals, they are probably in the 2-minute dump range. Dump for 2 minutes and then just leave, right? The other way, if we go to the board, I want to draw on the board real quick. If you're running square dumps, right? On these 10-inch square dumps, it works out to be about 2 inches up, a fifth of that, or a quarter, right? So one quarter to height. Some people put a line, they just put a piece of tape or mark it and say, okay, when the water level hits there, cut it and go. All right, so yeah, you are not dumping all your water. You want to get on the road. The only reason maybe would be that there is no other tanker behind you, right? You're not blocking anybody else out. So I want to close out with just a couple video clips. These are not us, but these were some drills at different places in the country. I tried to catch them at just different points. So I'll set the first one up. First one is from Delaware. And this is the transition between a attack tanker to the tanker's pumping off. It's an engine tanker. Meanwhile, the engine is beginning to set up for dump tank operations. Go.
Question from Dorsey. What size dump tanks are the tankers carrying?
So they are at least the size of their tanker. I don't know that answer for sure, to be honest with you. So Laytonsville, I believe, has a 4,000. I don't know what the two new ones came in with, other than that they have two of them. I want to say they're 2,500s, but I might be wrong. Somebody out there can reply back to the group if they know. Are you playing the video? So second clip, we're about the 7 minutes mark, Newcastle County, Delaware. And so a good example of the nurse tanker operation, initially, early on, we have tanker 59 is feeding the double clappered Siamese. Tanker 19 is pulled in and they're feeding the other side. Of course, they had just laid out, reverse lay from that ladder truck. Meanwhile, they're building out a dump tank operation, and they are going to draft from the front trying to use the single lane concept with square tanks. They do have a suction elbow. We're going to walk around here, take a quick look. Can you stop it right there and let me talk? With the picture back where it was or not? Okay, right there. Stop right there. All right, so let's just set the stage there. That engine tanker that you see sideways, that was pumping off water originally. And this engine you see straight ahead, that was the engine that they chose to move over to dump tank operations. That yellow dump tank came from that engine tanker, right? So they simply just didn't let it sit there and pump its water off. They grabbed that yellow tank to make that work. All right, next clip. All right, here we are about 11 minutes into it. We got 3 dump tanks down. The good part of carrying 2 dump tanks on 1 tanker. The red ones all came from the Oxford tanker, and we got those 3 down. So the 2 came from Oxford, the yellow came from the Hawkessen, and actually, came from tanker 59 out of Concordville. They just now switched over. The Tallyville engine has obtained a draft, and they're going to be in a process already of switching over and pumping. That image. Go back to that last image. Right, so the nice part about that second arriving tanker had 2 dump tanks on it. They grabbed both of them. So again, I'm going to tell you that if you have 31 or 13 as part of your water supply task force, you need to think about grabbing both of those dump tanks off when they are at the fireground. 3 more video clips short and then we'll go. So go to clip 3. Clip 3 is out of Oxford, PA. Go. All right, so we want to show this. This is a good setup, a good use of this double clapper Siamese. Right, so right now, Westgrove's tanker has arrived. They are going to pump this side of the double clapper down to that down to the engine that's going to pump the ladder truck, stimulate the initial water flow. Meanwhile, this engine over here is setting up the draft and setting up the dump tank operation. Right, so you got some redundancy, but this does not delay water flow. They'll be able to support this, which is nice, right, until they're ready on that dump tank. So the next tanker that's arrived is Avondale. We'll be waiting for them. They are either going to pump that double clapper or they're going to dump and transition to. So in that clip, that showed an engine and a tanker working together. The engine's working to set up a dump site. They don't wait on that. That tanker came in and is supplying that sides of that double clapper. They're running 5-inch hose, but that's what that yellow tanker supplied. You saw some water come from the engine. That was just because the guy engaged the pump and had a discharge open, but he closed that. So that yellow Mack tanker pumped that line. We have 2 questions real quick, so go.
All right, 2 points. One from Tim. The newest tankers are carrying 2 2,000-gallon single tanks. And from Harbison, generally 500 gallons higher than the tank size.
Yep. Gotcha. All right, let's go to the next clip. Clip 4, this is the transition over. Coming up on the 7-minute mark, water flow has started. They're in the process of transitioning over to a dump tank operation. So an excellent example of what we call the rural hitch in some parts of the United States, the use of the double clapper, right? That first tanker came in, they are building all this out. Meanwhile, the second tanker is pumping the double clapper all the way up and supporting the fire attack. So a good operation here. The tanker's left, he is just about empty. They got that first tank down. Now they're going to get the second tank in, and they're just about ready to switch over to dump tank operations. So we'll check back in to see how it goes. We're at 7.5 minutes. All right, before we play this next one, so that was a good example of supporting the fire attack at all costs, right? You cannot delay water going to that fire attack while you're trying to build all this stuff out. And that's why somebody's got to grab control of that. There were a lot of moving pieces in that last video, but what you didn't see was you didn't see the water supply to that attack engine interrupted, right? And those folks did a really good job because they ran 1,000+ gallon a minute, 2 hours, never lost water in that entire 2-hour period of time because of supporting that double clapper early on. And you saw that next tanker was ready to supply that if needed. Was it needed? Because they went to a dump tank. So there's a couple questions, right?
Yep.
Go.
A couple comments. Tanker 717 has a 4,000 gallon dump tank, and engine tank of 17 has 2,500.
Got it.
And here's a question. In your experience traveling, how many jurisdictions operate using the attack tanker operations?
So that's a tricky question. You should say successfully, right? So the vast majority of places that we go who are successful in water supply in the initial 15-minute operation, that's what I'll give you, 15 minutes. They don't run out of water at 15 minutes. All the ones that are successful use some version of a nurse tanker operation. Of the ones that fail, had the inability to get water from the tanker to the engine. Right? They all struggled in one way, shape, form, or another. They may have had 3 tankers and an engine, and they could not get the water from tanker 2 to the engine. All the places where you would look that they've done large flows for a long period of time, they all started off with nurse tanker, clappered Siamese, something to buy them time till they got the dump tank set up.
All right, from Rockville, is there anything to consider when placing floating tanks, i.e. on a hard road versus soft ground and keeping the tanks level?
No, you just have to work with what you got, right? Obviously, you want to try to keep them on a solid surfaces better. You're going to have to deal with crown of the road and all that. The thing would be, I would not, it's like moving furniture at your house, right? You could move it 42 times and still not be happy where it's at. You got to get it down, get it to where you believe it's going to work. Everybody knows where it's going to be at in terms of its position. You're ready to draft, and then let it go. Hard is better than soft. And the ability to put it in front of you or behind you is pretty important these days using the single lane tank concept. All right, so before we play this last video, this is the classic example of the engine tanker that could only pump off at 500 gallon a minute, right? It got into the mix. It's an older rig. It did not have a high flow capability. Plenty of water. I'm happy to have 2,000 gallons, but I can't offload it greater than 500. On the initial assignment, not a big deal, but think about if this is a water supply task force and you're trying to run a blitz fire and 2 attack lines at 750 or 800, this engine comes in, going to mess you up. That's why most likely on the water supply task force, you really, really have to be thinking about, do I need to move to a dump tank operation? All right, so play the video. 15-minute mark. Our flow is now 500 gallon a minute, still operating off of a nurse tanker operation. Fellows are trying to switch over to dump tank. Does not have that up and running yet. So this is going to be pretty critical, right? We hope that this different engine tanker has the ability to pump off at 500 gallon a minute. We assume that they do, but it's an older rig, not sure of the tank to pump line, and of course they have no high flow discharge. So unlike that first one, it had plenty of water, high flow and a large tank to pump. We don't know anything about this one. Okay, so you can take that down, go to the summary slide. Alrighty, so in a relatively short period of time, right, tried to talk about considerations of that water supply task force. It's just we don't use it much, right? I go back to the number of non-hydrogen box alarms, the number of non-hydrogen box alarms that are a working incident, then the number of those that the water supply task force actually makes it there, and then the number of those that it gets used. So it is pretty small. And there aren't strict guidelines for it because by the time that those assets get there, there's probably a bunch of different things you have to think about. I'm going to encourage the most important stuff is that engine on the water supply task force needs to be thinking about a secondary fill site, no different than a secondary water source in downtown Bethesda, right? Problem is that may be a mutual aid unit, and so that you may have to give direction to that mutual aid unit, right, to think about a secondary fill site. The other problem is that if it is a Montgomery unit, that's going to be the 7th engine. So where is that 7th engine coming from, and do they have area knowledge of where the fire is located in terms of fill sites? So you're going to have to help them a little bit. You can't just put them out there on their own and say, yeah, go find water, let us know what you got. Those tankers coming in, everybody who's running those tankers, you got to plan on pumping it off initially until somebody tells you something different, right? Hopefully, we'll move into a dump tank operation if we're going to engage the Water Supply Task Force assets. If not, first arriving tanker has got to be ready. Where's that clappered Siamese? How am I pumping it? Hey, do you need my dump tanks? Right. Water supply officer, we spoke about that. Right. That person should be appointed early, get all those assets on a different channel. Only let the incident commander know basic stuff, right? Incident commander should tell the water supply officer, here's the fire flow, and the water supply officer's job is to figure out how to meet that. Have another question, and then we're going to wrap it up.
All right, do you direct water supply task force tankers to come in from a specific direction, or do you let the water supply officer work it out?
I would defer that to the water supply officer. That person should establish a running route, right? If a running route is important, which in a tanker shuttle it eventually is going to be, so that you don't get folks nose to nose. Early on, that can happen that way. Later on, you want to try to get that sorted out so they're going in some semblance of order. Incident commander should be remote from all that, right? You just say, look, I need 750 gallon a minute. Call me if you need something. Another question?
All right, does MCFRS have a water map for incident commanders?
No. Meaning, what do you mean by water map? You mean a chart or do you mean a map? So the easy answer is no on either one, really.
Yeah, like WSSC.
Yeah, so all those are loaded. Those water supply maps are all loaded on the battalion platform MDTs. They may be on the units. I don't ride an engine, I couldn't tell you, but I do know on the battalion chief platform on that MDT are all the water supply maps. Rockville City at WSSC, also you have all the box maps, and on the battalion iPads you have the same thing, right? So all that does exist. In fact, I was just looking at City of Rockville's last night, sitting in my office, looking at some hydrant stuff in the City of Rockville. So it all exists. Another question?
How important is it to have your highest GPM pumper being your supply unit?
So the general rule that anybody would have learned in pump operator school, when you're building a water supply operation, you try to put the largest capacity pumper at the source. Montgomery County, we all are the largest capacity pumpers, right? So if you're bringing a Crimson or a Pierce, it doesn't matter. That's a 2250, 2300 gallon a minute pumper from draft, not a big deal. The only time that could be an issue would be mutual aid, and again, am I really going to change it out, right? If I brought an engine in and I got no other choice, I'm not going to say, well, hang on a minute, I'm waiting on a big engine to come. I'm just not, right? So while it's nice on paper, you generally have to deal with the order of arrival unless you know that you can make a quick change at some point. Anything else? Otherwise, we're going to wrap it up. No other questions? All right, so that went longer than 60 minutes, but that's okay. We had some good questions. So this is a different format for us. We're working through how to answer questions and so forth. Appreciate everybody's cooperation and participation. If you have any questions, right, you can certainly email me if you need to at the county email address, or call me at the battalion office. Otherwise, I do encourage folks to at least practice, right, how fast can I get that tanker hooked up to pump off water, right? Driver only rolls in, tags that double clappered Siamese, get that going, pump that off. That should be one of those situation reps. It's like pulling an 1.5 inch attack line. How fast can the one person do that? How fast can my driver do that? And all our tankers should be able to do that fast. Right? So that's all I have. Chief Thomas talked about some other upcoming episodes of the COPDI. Pay attention for those flyers coming out. And other than that, enjoy the rest of your day. It's a beautiful day outside.